Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm going to do a quick book recap of all the books that I ended up reading in February. Now, I know I missed one of the videos from last week. It's not that I wasn't reading the books, it's just I've had a lot and then all of the things happened. So I'm probably going to come back and do an individual book review for maybe a few of the ones that I read in February. I'm going to talk about this more when I touch on these individual books, but some of the books I was going to do a review of right away, and then I wanted to dig more into the subject matter, so I got more books based on it. Maybe those videos will become something a little bit more than a book review and a little bit more of like a deep dive into what those books are actually talking about, which I'm pretty excited about starting and trying. So the first book that I dug into in February was actually recommended to me by somebody, and it is called The Kin of Ata or Ada? Ata? I don't know. The Kin of Ada Are Waiting for You. Oh my God, already? This is why I gotta do this when the sun is low on the horizon. This book was actually praised by Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple. She won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I believe sometime in the 80s for said book. And it was recommended to me by a friend who likes really deep, introspective kind of examinations of character and certain aspects of life. Reading through this, I had a really difficult time with this book. Not really because of any of the deep dives that they did into human nature. I really couldn't connect with this book. So basically what happens is you follow the protagonist, who seems to be like a really stuck up, self-indulged writer who is full of himself and doesn't take anybody else into consideration. You get this right in the first 5 to 10 pages where there's a really intense scene, and he ends up fleeing from that scene and then ends up in a car crash and then wakes up basically in this strange world where nobody is speaking his language, and they do a series of rituals every day, and he has to kind of become part of this life because there's no real way for him to escape. So his only choice is to be forced into this world, and then living through this world, he kind of sees the absurdity of his self-indulgences and his self-obsessions, and kind of turns over a new leaf over the course of next 220 pages. This seems like a decent character growth arc. There were a few issues I had with the book. First, which is like the least egregious of all of them, was within the first 100 pages there were like 2 or 3 typos, which I thought was weird considering this was released by a major publisher. Now, it wasn't first published by a major publisher, but it was picked up, I believe, by HarperCollins sometime in the 90s, and then published through them, which, you know, I just thought they would do a little bit more copy editing. My major issue with this, and there's going to be some content warning here if, you know, strong sexual content and violence, if that bothers you, I'm going to have chapters down below so you can skip over to the next review. When he comes into this place, there doesn't seem to really be any scenes. It's kind of like long exposition about just the rituals that these people do, and they don't seem to be very consequential. It's just something that he's forced to witness for a long period of time, and then he carries over his appetites into this world, and he actually and here's like the sexual violence part, so again, warning, if this bothers you, just fast forward to the next review or the next book that I read in February. But at one point he grabs one of the women and then just tries to essentially rape her there on the spot, and then all the people kind of surround him and bear witness, which makes him feel very awkward. So he just does it later in a different spot, and then as things progress later on, there are some very strange conclusions brought about by that, including the fact that that woman comes back to him and then they end up making love and having a child. Making love, I don't know why I even use that term. They end up having sex again and having a child, and the conclusion from that was basically like, oh, you having sex with me now is like cleansing the previous heinous crime I committed to your person earlier on in this book. And it was very I didn't find it very convincing in terms of like any real characterization. I found that these were very much caricatures for basically trying to get the message across that was in the book. And some people really love this book. It gets a lot of good reviews on Amazon and on Goodreads as well, I think. But there weren't any scenes that the character really went through that I thought were convincing. And the main character was really dumb. Like, there are certain points where he's like, oh, I get how this place works. And it's like painfully obvious that they're a commune. Individualism is completely like wiped out. Everybody lives for the sake of the collective. And it takes him so long to understand that is what's going on. Even after he will explicitly notice what's going on and how they live their life. And you think he's got it. And then he does something like a few pages later that clearly shows that he's he doesn't have it. At one point, he finds somebody who is also trapped on this island, and he's not from the island. He came from the outside world, just like the main character did. They notice something about the main character, and then the other guy who's just like him starts to smile. And, you know, if you were the main character and you were desperate to escape, you might think, well, you know, this guy maybe has some clues, he can get me out of here. But he gets so offended by the fact that the guy's smiling at him that he like slaps this 80-year-old man so hard that he dies instantly. Yeah, I didn't like the main character very much, and I found that the plot was very meandering. But if you like a book that really likes to examine the faults of materialism, individualism, how somebody can be self-obsessed, and basically it seems like the collective on the island doesn't punish him for any of these things. They simply let him do it in an environment where the absurdity of his own acts force himself to look in on how egregious they are and how terrible they are, and figure out for himself that he has to change, which I didn't really find that convincing, but others might. So yeah, this was a really hard book for me to connect with, but that was just me. The next book that I read this month, guys, and I have a dedicated review that I'm going to put down in the description for this one, was Greenlights by Matthew McConaughey. Wasn't a book that I was expecting to enjoy, but I thought it was an absolute blast. This was basically a book that went through his life. It's somewhat of a memoir, but it's wrapped up in the form of various journal entries that he's been keeping for many years. I thought that there were a lot of interesting ways in which Matthew McConaughey really self-examines his life and the steps that have taken him through major successes and downfalls within that life, so that he can kind of pull back, take those lessons, and then apply them further down the road. And I found that in the review, I stated that, you know, he remains surprisingly grounded while at the same time having a lot of confidence in what he's truly capable of. And I think a lot of that comes down to the practice of keeping the journal, where you can actually, you know, take account of the decisions you make in your day-to-day life and then reflect on those in a way that's actually meaningful and that you can act upon to improve your life later on. So I thought that was pretty cool. If you're a fan of Matthew McConaughey, check out the audiobook for that, because he narrates it himself, and it's an absolute joy to hear him do so. The next one that I don't want to do a dedicated review for until I am done the series, and I will be finishing the series, which I'm very excited about, because it's going to be the first series in the first fantasy series of all time that I will have finally finished, and that is the First Law trilogy. So I finished the second book in the trilogy, Before They Are Hanged, I believe it was called. I entirely listened to this one on audiobook. The first one I read the physical copy. This one I listened to and I had a blast. I thought the narrator did a really good job. In terms of the character growth, I'm not going to really spoil anything for this one, because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who might not have read the first book yet. But long story short, is it worth it to continue the series if you've read the first book and you kind of like it? I would say so. So in my initial review for the First Law trilogy, which is a really bad review, because this is one of the first book reviews that I ever did, one of the things that I mentioned was that Glokta was really the star of the show, and that is still kind of the case here. But what I also mentioned in that review is that I kind of liked Logan Nine Fingers, and I was pretty indifferent towards Giselle. I found that a lot more of the character growth happened within this book. I felt book number one was kind of pretty much setting up the plot for the adventure that we were going to have, and the second book kind of dove into that adventure a little bit and had some key plot points that forced some character change out of various characters and put some roadblocks in the way that I thought was pretty interesting and kept me pretty intrigued throughout the read. So it definitely enticed me to buy the last book in the series. I am going to do that. I'm not going to jump into it right away, because a good friend of mine is catching up in the series, and we're going to try to buddy read that last one together so we can share our thoughts on it. I really like Joe Abercrombie's style. I'm not a very high fantasy kind of person. I like fantasy that deals more with the characters and the interactions, and that seemed to be the case for The Blade itself, which is the first book in the series, and that definitely carried over into Before They Are Hanged. This is a book in a series where if you do not like the characters, if you don't like the character interaction or the writing style, I don't think that the plot is going to redeem the rest of the book for you. So just keep that in mind if you dig into this series. So this next book is one that I wanted to do a book review on right away, but instead I kind of end up having a discussion about it, and that made me pick up more books on the topic and read some scientific articles on the topic. And this is one of those things where certain books I start to read and they actually deal with subject matter that I think should be explored more deeply, and that's something that I'm going to start to do on the channel, because I think those are some of the things that I like to I like to watch and I like to listen to the most isn't just what a book is like to read, but what it means and what it really touches on. So I was asking a friend of mine what books deal with drug use in a fiction or a nonfiction setting. In a fiction setting, the only two books that I've ever read that really dealt with drug use in, effective way. Actually, that's not true. I've read more. Son of a Trickster did a really good job with it, with substance abuse. But in terms of like, I don't know, maybe more of a fantasy kind of thing, was Perdido Street Station, but also Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World also talks about it when the characters in that book take soma. Sure enough, my buddy referred me to Doors of Perception, which is written by Aldous Huxley, the same person who wrote A Brave New World, and the book is basically him documenting himself having a mescaline trip, which is, I don't have any experience with mescaline other than watching the scenes from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and some secondhand accounts from people who have, we won't get into that. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that Aldous Huxley would write this kind of take on what his experience was like under the influence of a psychedelic, and that made me pick up How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, who is a scientist that digs into a little bit more of this. I looked up some research in terms of MAPS, which is an institution or an organization, I should say, that is doing a lot of research into psychedelic therapies for various mental illnesses and addictions. And as a Canadian, we have a lot of that research going on in Canada as well as therapies being developed using various what were once perceived as recreational drugs for the sake of general treatment and genuine treatment for people who need it, with very, very positive results. So I'm gonna read a couple more books on this, and hopefully I'll dig into a little bit more detail with regard to this book. Doors of Perception is super short and it's pretty interesting. I mean, if you're curious as to what a psychedelic experience might be like and you have zero interest in taking psychedelics, I do not blame you. That's not for everybody. Check out Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and that might give you a little window into what that experience might be like. So during this month, I continued my romp through the history of human misery, basically. I ended up picking up The Gulag, A History by Anne Applebaum, Mao, The Untold Story, Bury Me at Wounded Knee, which details the heinous crimes committed against the indigenous people of America when Europeans came. And then I started reading like several pages of each one, and it got me to this pretty, I'm not going to say despair, but I felt kind of miserable. So I needed to kind of do a 180, and then I ended up listening to An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. This one I'm going to do a full review on as well because I thought it was pretty interesting. I would elevator pitch Hank Green's book as Ready Player One I would pitch this book as if John Green tried to write a Ready Player One type book. So you're going to get a lot of the kind of introspective aspect of character development that John Green puts in his books. The voicing is very much John Green, right? The main characters of An Absolutely Remarkable Thing are one age group higher. They're in their early 20s instead of their teens, but you could interchange these, aside from their actual professions, you could interchange these voices with the teenagers from John Green's book, and I don't really think you would tell much of a difference. But the engineering and science background that Hank brings really adds another kind of layer to it, and the way he builds the plot, I think Hank Green's plot work is a little bit better than John Green's, but I think he maintains a lot of John's intimate analysis of certain aspects of human nature. I think where Hank Green really does a lot of good in An Absolutely Remarkable Thing is touching on a lot of really relevant current issues, particularly when it comes to the media and how the media is interpreted and how people can manipulate that for the sake of certain volatile movements, we'll say. And I thought that was a smart thing to touch on because, I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I read everything, but it's not something that I see really touched on in fiction in an effective way. And I thought Hank Green did it pretty responsibly and pretty effectively. It didn't ring true with everybody, but I thought it was very well done, and I had a good time reading it too. The last one, I technically finished it right in the beginning of March, but I read the bulk of it in February, and that was Pet Sematary by Stephen King. Pet Sematary. So the reason why I picked this one up is because another booktuber who I enjoy watching very much, even though she tore apart one of my favorite books recently, is Murphy Napier. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. I apologize. Being Canadian, I feel like it should be like Napier. or something like that, but it's probably not pronounced that way. Anyway, she brought up Pet Sematary as a Stephen King book that she enjoyed because of its depiction of grief, and I wanted to see how Stephen King handled that. I have to say that I agree. I think that's the best aspect of this Stephen King book. But as I mentioned in my interview, or in my review for The Stand, Stephen King is all over the map for me. Like The Gunslinger, right? The first book in the Dark Tower series, I had a great time. That burp is my review for the second book in the Dark Tower series. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. To the point where like I could have put down Stephen King forever, and for some reason I picked up The Stand, and The Stand was a great time. I had a fantastic time during The Stand. So I picked up Pet Sematary off of Murphy's recommendation, and I did enjoy it. Did I love it? No, I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5 stars, maybe 3.5. One thing that really bothers me about Stephen King is that he meanders with his prose a lot. So when I get to the last 100 pages, and it's very predictable what's going to happen by the end of the book, even I would say like a quarter of a third or a third of the way through the book, you know exactly how it's going to end. And when you get to those 100 pages, that last 100 pages where you're waiting for that final thing to end, he'll like be getting to the point and then like just take a random aside for like 3 paragraphs. And it's like, I just want to know what's going to happen at that point. I feel like he got any philosophical dissertations he wanted to out of the way by that point. And I thought those were well done. I really like Judd Crandall, and I like the conversations that they had. I like that whole like mentor sort of role that a character can play. Yeah, it was a fun book, but it wasn't, I would put it above Dark Tower 2, but on maybe below Dark Tower 1, definitely below The Stand. But I will say that at the halfway point of the book, where like the thing happens, where again, Murphy says it's an examination of grief. They're going to be grieving over something. Once that grieving happens, I thought that was by far the strongest part of the book. So I'm in 100% agreement there. I thought that was a really good way to go about it. Yeah, just the final execution was, it was good. It was fine. Is this going to put me off Stephen King for good? No. It's not that I dislike his writing style. He has this tendency in his prose that really kills me, where like he will go through like some decent writing that I really enjoy, and then he'll throw in just like, it feels like maybe while he's writing, he's having a couple drinks, and he's like that one drink too deep, and he gets this line in his head, and he's like, yeah, that's a good line, or like, that's a funny punch, and I just don't, it doesn't ring with me. The whole hey ho, let's go thing, I found that really weird and random. So the book's strength is definitely in its examination of grief rather than necessarily like pacing. I find like his pacing is always, you can never tell where it's quite going to go. All right, guys, so that is every book that I read in February of this year. I think it was 6 books. Yeah. So decent month. I do intend to dig into quite a bit more for the month of March, but a lot of those books are going to be some of these non-fiction kind of heavy dark books. So I'm not sure if I'm going to hit 6 books this month. And I want to spend some time working on a few different types of videos. I'm also getting back to work a little bit, so the pace or the schedule for those videos might be thrown off, but I'm going to do my best to get right back on that weekly train. All right, guys, let me know what you read for the month of February. If there's a good recommendation you have, I'd love to hear it, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Os.